Hey everybody out in YouTube land, my name is Mike and I love guitars. In today's video, we're going to take a look at what is quite possibly Mesa Boogie's most maligned and hated amp ever. We're going to check out my Stiletto Deuce. Let's do this. I like Marshall amps and I like Mesa amps. In particular, I like the tonal mix of a Marshall and a Mesa together. In most of the bands I've been in the past, I've pretty much always been the Marshall guy, and the other guitar players have always been the Mesa guys. Unsurprisingly, everybody I was in bands with always went with rectifiers, but I was always a little more intrigued by the Stiletto. From what I understood about the Stiletto at the time, it was an EL34 powered Mesa that really sounded more like a Marshall than the rectifiers that everyone was buying at that point. Channel 1 of the Stiletto has a plexi-like tone, while Channel 2 is similar to a JCM 800. Think of it as Boogie's interpretation of an 800. And in typical Mesa fashion, the Stiletto has tons of knobs and switches for tonal variations. Here's a funny thing about the Stiletto though. A lot of people hate this amp. If you Google Mesa Stiletto, you will find a mountain of old internet forum posts talking about how terrible it sounds. They say it's all high-end and brittle sounding. The thing is, this amp does have a lot of treble. The user manual even specifically states that the treble and gain knobs are the two most powerful controls on the amp. What does this mean? Well, if you just crank the treble and presence like you might on other amps, then you just gave yourself way too much treble. How do you fix that? Well, you dial in the amp with your ears and not your eyes. It's also worth mentioning that the typical Marshall sound is much more of a high mid-tone than the darker rectifier sound. So I've always kind of wondered if maybe the people who hated the Stiletto so much just weren't expecting it to sound quite so Marshall-like. Well, several years ago when checking out some nearby pawn shops, if you're new to my channel, I love pawn shops. I came across this Mesa Stiletto Deuce at a pretty decent price. After a little negotiation and a little layaway, I ended up bringing it home. I didn't have a JCM 800 at the time, so the Stiletto was a great way to get a very similar tone for recording. A couple of years later, I did finally end up getting an 800, and to be honest, the Stiletto really hasn't gotten much playing time since then. Since I haven't played it in a while, I've decided to trade it to my buddy Shelby, ironically in exchange for his rectifier. But before it goes to a new home, we're going to shoot it out with my JCM 800 and see how they sound compared to each other. For the audio demos, I'll be using my 2006 Fender Highway 1 Strat. Both amps will be boosted by an Ibanez TS9 Tube Screamer, and for a cabinet, I'll be using a 2-notes Marshall 412 IR. On the Stiletto, I have it set to diode rectification, and I'm using channel 2 with the crunch gain setting. The Stiletto actually has a bit more gain than the 800 does, but since I'm trying to get them to sound somewhat similar, I've just backed the gain off on the Stiletto to more closely match what the 800 has. It is worth mentioning that my JCM 800 isn't stock. It's been modified to run 6550 power tubes, so it's a little dirtier sounding than a stock 800. Even so, it still retains that core classic 800 sound. When compared to the Stiletto, they definitely do sound similar. Sounding similar, though, doesn't mean the same. They definitely have the same overall vibe, but the Stiletto has a bit more mid-range to the tone, while the Marshall has noticeably more high-end. And I find that more than a little interesting, considering the #1 complaint I've seen about the Stiletto online is that it has too much high-end. To me, this kind of reinforces the idea that maybe long-term Mesa players think the Stiletto has too much high-end because they're so used to the typical Mesa low-end thump. Whatever the cause for all that hate may be, I think the Stiletto is a great sounding amp that just got a bad reputation that it really didn't deserve. Sonically, it sits in a really cool place somewhere between an 800 and a rectifier. It's a little meatier than your typical Marshall, but a little less meaty than your typical rectifier. It definitely won't win any awards for best modern high gain tones, but it's great for a rock/hard rock sound. I'm still going to trade it to my buddy Shelby, but now I'm kind of wishing I'd done some more recording with it over the last couple of years. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. I had fun getting in a final jam with this amp before it goes to a new home, and I hope you enjoyed checking it out with me. What do you guys think about this amp? Do you think it deserves all the hate it gets? Have you spent any time playing through one? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Oh man. Here we go. I am getting too old for this.